At the start of the Second World War, the United Kingdom was one of the world's preeminent naval powers, boasting a fleet that could project power across the world. However, that didn't mean that they weren't infallible. Take HMS Courageous, for example, sunk by a U-boat on September 17, 1939, taking 500 of her crew down with her, just 2 weeks after the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. Or HMS Barham, sunk in 1941, also because of a U-boat, being rather infamous due to her loss being filmed. Nevertheless, in the disastrous explosion, she took almost 900 men down with her. Especially during the first several years of the war, the United Kingdom lost a number of capital ships, including battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers. And in today's video, we'll look at some of the most disastrous losses. Starting with Courageous and a little bit of background, on September 1st, 1939, the Second World War began with the German invasion of Poland. In response to that, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. The Germans already had several surface ships, including the Admiral Graf Spee, in position to attack Allied shipping. The Kriegsmarine would also order U-boats out to do a similar job. With the U-boat campaigns of the First World War a recent memory, the Royal Navy would have several strategies to deal with these underwater threats. The first being the convoy system, in which merchant ships would be gathered together and travel as a group under the escort of warships equipped to deal with the U-boat threat. One of the tools developed to help counter this threat would be ASDIC, otherwise known as sonar. Although having a limited range, it was adequate for ships escorting convoys, as they would be able to position themselves around the merchant ships and hopefully be able to locate the approaching U-boat before it sank any ships. Another strategy the Royal Navy implemented would be through the use of aircraft to spot U-boats moving into the Atlantic. Although the newer U-boats would have the fuel capacity to reach the Atlantic by going around the north of Scotland. The last strategy, which will play a critical role in our story, was the Carrier Hunter-Killer Group, where it consisted of a carrier and her escorting destroyers that used aircraft to patrol a large area of sea, and if the aircraft spotted a U-boat, it would radio its position, and some of the escorting destroyers raced off to help attack the U-boat. There were other hunter-killer groups consisting of cruisers that were to deal with surface raiders, but on September 17th, HMS Courageous was off the southwest coast of Ireland conducting such an offensive operation against U-boats when she was sunk by U-29. On September 16th, Courageous sailed from Plymouth, escorted by 4 destroyers, to carry out offensive air operations against enemy submarines off the southwestern coast of Ireland. The reason being, this area was a critical component of the so-called Western Approaches, where a majority of Britain's shipping ports were located. The next afternoon, on the 17th, Courageous was steaming westward at high speed to catch up with aircraft that had taken off at 4:15 p.m. to attack a U-boat that was shelling the merchant vessel SS Kafiristan. When the strike group of aircraft left, 2 of the escorting destroyers, Inglefeld and Intrepid, raced ahead to assist the hunt for the offending submarine, leaving Courageous with only Ivanhoe on her port side and Impulsive on her starboard bow. At about 7:20 that night, Courageous turned onto a southeasterly course into the wind to reduce speed to help the striking force to land. 35 minutes later, at 7:55, 2 large explosions in rapid succession could be heard and felt throughout the ship. All the lights in the ship went dark, and she began to list heavily to port. The attacker was a German U-boat, U-29, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Otto Schuott. U-29 had been at sea for several weeks and was returning to Germany through the English Channel. Around 6 p.m., Schuott spotted the carrier group and began to pursue it, not being in a favorable enough position to attack the carrier until she turned onto a southeasterly course to recover her aircraft. U-29 fired a spread of 3 torpedoes, with 2 of them striking Courageous. One of the torpedoes striking just abreast of the petty officer's flat, and the other at the after end of B boiler room. Following this, HMS Ivanhoe turned to attack and drop depth charges. Meanwhile, HMS Impulsive headed to the starboard bow and dropped astern to pick up men abandoning the ship. However, U-29 made its escape, being vigorously hunted until past midnight, and returned to Germany. After that, her captain received the Iron Cross First Class, and the crew received the Iron Cross Second Class. Back on board Courageous, following the two explosions, the lights went out, and the ship immediately took on a heavy list. As the power went out almost immediately, the Typhon siren started and could not be stopped. The quartermaster reported that the ship had lost all steering. Following this, Captain W.T. Making Jones ordered that the ship's position be sent out, while the signal books were being collected for destruction. At 8:05 p.m., loud crashing noises were heard, these most likely being bulkheads collapsing, and the ship took on an even more prominent list of about 35 degrees. Captain Making Jones ordered that the international code signal, "Stand by me," be hoisted, and said that anyone who wished to leave the ship was at liberty to do so. On the upper decks, all boats except sea boats were turned in and secured. Due to the severe list, no boats on the starboard side, except the cutter, could be lowered, which had apparently sustained damage and became waterlogged shortly after being lowered into the water. Other boats on the port side were lowered by some ratings, along with Carley floats. Things like gratings and loose woodwork were tossed into the water to assist the men in treading water. Between decks, all important watertight doors had been closed, but due to the heavy list and without power, it was impossible to close the remaining doors. Shortly after the explosion, the captain had ordered that the starboard bulges be flooded, but the order did not get through. Still, Lieutenant Sedgwick, along with two other men, proceeded to the Z Seacock and attempted to flood the starboard bulge, but due to the explosion, they were unable to do so. In the hangars, the few officers and men who were there when the torpedoes struck were able to escape, although personnel in the lower hangar had difficulty in forcing a way through the fire curtains as they had been jammed. Lieutenant Shenton was on watch in the forward center engine room where, after the explosion and the loss of power, he ordered that the starboard engines be stopped and ordered the engine room's evacuation. As steam was falling rapidly with a considerable steam leak, Shenton operated the emergency bulkhead valve, closed the lever, and rang the sprayer telegraphs to 0. As for the other engine room, a stoker came from the boiler room with his overalls on fire and could give no information. Other men who came up could give no information either. It would take only about 20 minutes for Courageous to go down, taking over 500 men down with her, including Captain Making Jones, as well as the ferry Swordfish aircraft of the 811th and 822nd Air Squadrons. As Impulsive was rescuing survivors, she was soon joined by the American merchant ship Collingsworth, the British merchant ship Dido, and the Dutch passenger ship Veendam, which launched 14 lifeboats, but the rescue work would prove difficult as the sea was covered in oil. Further help arrived as other Royal Navy ships came. Taking from HMS Courageous 1939, Eyewitnesses of World War II, we'll take a look at the account of Sub-Lieutenant I.F. West Maycott. This account was originally printed in the Daily Telegraph about a week after the sinking of Courageous. Paymaster Sub-Lieutenant I.F. West Maycott, the captain's secretary, was having his supper in the Courageous when he heard two explosions, which seemed to lift the ship. All lights went out and crockery fell over, he continued. I got out of the wardroom and made my way to the seaplane platform on the top of the quarterdeck. People waiting there did not seem to realize that the ship would sink soon. Suddenly, an order was given for everyone to get into the water. Some men went to the floats and others got boats out. I stripped and jumped into the water. I was in about 40 minutes, swimming all the time, until I reached one of the destroyers. Everybody behaved with a calm, and the men cracked jokes. There was no panic or disorder. Almost immediately after the attack, the Courageous began to list to port, and within 5 minutes, the captain gave the order to abandon her. Her bows were submerged, her stern cocked up into the air, and she foundered within 15 to 20 minutes of being hit. The ship that had succeeded Courageous in the home fleet, Ark Royal, also went on to do these anti-submarine patrols and was attacked by a U-boat, U-39, but survived her attack. With the sinking of Courageous, and with Ark Royal almost suffering the same fate, the Admiralty soon decided that the carriers were far too valuable to risk in such patrols, and the carrier hunter-killer group concept was abandoned for the time being. This iteration of the carrier hunter-killer group was certainly one of First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's less successful ideas. Next, Royal Oak, a subject we have not really broached on the channel before, and for good reason. Normally, I wouldn't open a section with a quote. Still, in The Gathering Storm, The Naval War in Northern Europe, September 1939 to 1940, by Gerhard, he writes, "The sinking of the battleship Royal Oak by U-47 at Scapa Flow has become one of the most controversial events of the early part of the Second World War at sea. This is partially because of the audacious way in which it was accomplished, partly because of the significance it had on the war at sea, but not least because of the many mysteries and legends surrounding the event. Added to the sinking of the Athenia and Courageous, the loss of Royal Oak brutally forced the British Admiralty to take the threat from U-boats seriously, changing the development of the Royal Navy forever. Now, we won't delve into the consequences of the loss or the journey of U-47 into Scapa Flow, commanded by Captain Prian, as that has been covered in so many documentaries and books that almost all of you know the story. Where our story picks up is early in the morning of October 14th, 1939. At 1:04 in the morning on October the 14th, 1939, HMS Royal Oak was lying at single anchor in Scapa Bay when an explosion occurred right forward on the starboard side below the water. Its effects was to break all the slips on both cables, which allowed the port cable to run out to a clinch and let go the starboard anchor. The explosion itself and the effect of the cable running out got the attention of most of the officers and some of the ship's company. The admiral, captain, commander, engineering commander, and others hurried on deck, putting on very few clothing over their pajamas. Many officers who were aft thought that the explosion was in or under the after part of the ship, this being accounted for by the vibration effect from the other end of the ship. This is how Admiral Drax opened up his report on the events. U-47, under the command of Prian, had snuck its way through Scapa Flow and fired 3 torpedoes at Royal Oak. The captain, William Ben of Royal Oak, was awoken among others and began to investigate. He was informed that it was most likely an internal explosion in the inflammable store, and a certain amount of flooding occurred. Still, the CO2 compartment immediately aft seemed intact, and the stability of the ship was in good condition, and everything seemed in hand for the first few minutes. Reginald Nichols, executive officer of Royal Oak, writes, "That night, as usual, we darkened the ship and were alert to air attack. I turned in at about 10:30 p.m., only to be awakened by a heavy shaking of the ship. The time was 4 minutes past 1. Throwing on a coat, I went on deck, but no one could tell me what had happened, so I continued forward to the forecastle where there was an acrid smell. I could see by the light of a faint aurora that the stopper on the starboard cable had been parted and the cable run out to a clinch. Evidently, the trouble was below in the cable locker flat, where I found the captain and engineer commander. It seemed an explosion had occurred in the inflammable store, and a man was going down in a smoke helmet to investigate. The ship's company was generally undisturbed by what was going on, and there are several records of men having turned out and then turned in again between the first and second explosions. During this interval, the launch and picket boat were called away. The drifter Daisy 2 was ordered to raise steam, and 2 prisoners were released from their cells. But, as I mentioned, there were more explosions, and at 1:16 a.m., 3 explosions were registered, and there was no doubt something serious was happening. U-47 had fired more torpedoes. The first torpedo had hit forward of amidships, the second abreast the boiler rooms, and the third just forward of number 3 dynamo room. The ship lurched and took on a pronounced list to starboard. Most of the men were asleep below decks or were at their action stations in or around the battery or mess decks. About half the vertical doors were closed as a routine precaution. Many of these jammed from the explosions and subsequent list, and a large number of men were trapped below. Shortly after the initial explosions, it appeared one of the magazines was ignited, sending sheets of flame through the ship. Many men were killed and others burned. Nichols continues his account. Then, just 13 minutes after the first explosion came, three more sickening, shattering thuds abaft us on the starboard side. Each explosion rocked the ship alarmingly. All lights went out, and she at once took on a list to starboard of about 25 degrees. There was no doubt in my mind what happened this time, nor what was going to happen. How on earth did a submarine get through the defenses? In addition to the heavy damage done by the torpedoes, there were a large number of portholes open, fitted with light excluding ventilators. I knew every one of these on the starboard side must be submerged, and it would be impossible to close them against the incoming rush of water. There was no electric power to work the derrick to hoist any of the larger boats, and because of the ever-increasing list, many of the smaller boats could not be lowered. Just minutes after the second salvo of 3 torpedoes had struck, the Royal Oak sank. In the short struggle that followed, I recall only a frantic rush, and when she had sank under me, how cold the water was on my feet as my short sea boots fell off. Then, in the darkness, an intense feeling of loneliness seized me, and I remember little else until I found myself sharing a raft with several others, all soaked in a foul-smelling, slippery, chilly mixture of seawater and oil fuel. Royal Oak sank at 1:29 after being hit by several torpedoes from U-47, with around 833 out of the 1,250 aboard that night losing their lives. There's obviously a lot of controversy surrounding the sinking, and I want to take a bit from the official report. No such warning was received, and it was not until the second, third, and fourth explosions occurred in quick succession that anyone realized that an enemy attack had been made. Consequently, no additional precautions were taken after the first explosion. After the other explosions, light and power failed, and the ship heeled over and sank so quickly that nothing could be done. Individual lifebelts had not even been supplied to the ship, so that the men had only a limited quantity of floats, wood, etc. Skipping ahead a bit, there were probably 4 explosions, one right forward on the starboard side, the remainder extending from A to X turrets on the starboard side. All torpedoes seem to have hit this side, and there is no evidence to suggest a magnetic pistol or any such weapon under the bottom. Like I said, there's quite a bit of controversy surrounding the events of the sinking, and I just wanted to say, if you want to argue about it in the comments, please do so respectfully with one another. It is early in the morning of May 24th, 1941. The battleship Bismarck and the escorting cruiser Prince Eugen, under the overall command of Admiral Gunther Lütjens, are making their way through the Denmark Strait in an attempt to break out into the Atlantic to attack British shipping. Trailing behind them are the British heavy cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk, which have been shadowing the German ships since the previous day, just far enough to be out of the range of Bismarck's guns. However, closing in on the 2 German ships are the 2 large British capital ships, the brand new HMS Prince of Wales, equipped with 10 14-inch guns, and the large HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, equipped with 8 15-inch guns. Soon, the pride of the Royal Navy would be at the bottom of the sea. The German ship's journey began several days earlier, leaving from Danzig and making their way through the Kattegat, the narrow passage between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, proceeding through the North Sea, around Iceland, and into the Denmark Strait. For the Royal Navy, the first intelligence of the German breakout would come on the 20th when Swedish observers reported Bismarck's passage through the Kattegat, and the following day a Spitfire would report the presence of 2 cruisers in the Grimstad Fjord, near Bergen. Admiral Tovey, the commander-in-chief of the home fleet, thought Lütjens would take advantage of some foul weather and make the breakout into the Atlantic, one of 2 ways, either through the Iceland-Faroes Gap or around Iceland and through the Denmark Strait. The latter was the most likely path that the German ships would take, as it was safer, being farther away from the British Isles and therefore harder for the British to observe their movements. Tovey would dispatch ships to watch these entrances into the Atlantic, sending the heavy cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk to watch the Denmark Strait. In the meantime, not knowing if Lütjens had sailed as he had not received the report of the Spitfire pilot, he ordered the Hood and the Prince of Wales west, hedging his bets that Lütjens would use the Denmark Strait, and Tovey would sail with the home fleet once it was clear that Lütjens had sailed, which was confirmed on the 22nd of May. Tovey sorted with King George V, the battlecruiser Repulse, and the aircraft carrier Victorious, and by then, Hood and Prince of Wales were over 500 miles away. On Hood, commanding the force, was Admiral Lancelot Holland, who had already seen battle previously in the Mediterranean under Admiral Somerville during the Battle of Cape Spartivento. Somerville and his subordinates, including Holland, had been criticized for being overcautious and not pursuing the Italian ships. Keep this in mind, as it will be an important factor in the battle. By the evening of the 23rd of May, as HMS Suffolk turned southward on her patrol in the Denmark Strait, at 7:22 p.m., a lookout spotted a large gray shape emerging from the mist and fog. By 8 p.m. that evening, both Norfolk and Suffolk were shadowing the two German ships, staying close enough to track them through the fog banks and snow showers while remaining outside of Bismarck's gun range. Holland, on the Bridge of Hood around 300 miles out, with Bismarck almost due north of him, decided to increase speed and turn to the northwest to cut Bismarck off. This decision was made with Churchill in mind, who preferred an admiral that kept to the tradition of the service and was aggressive in their actions. Holland could have continued on a westward course and met Bismarck and Prince Eugen in the North Atlantic. Instead, he chose to turn and engage the enemy, in the process directing the captain of the Prince of Wales, John Leach, to follow his movements, and the two large ships maneuvered through the Arctic night. The next morning, with the sun already risen, the opposing ships were 32,000 yards away at 5:35 a.m. In World War II at Sea by Craig L. Simmons, he writes, "On board the Prince of Wales, the ship's chaplain, W.G. Parker, read a prayer over the ship's loudspeaker. It was a prayer that had been offered by parliamentary forces at the Battle of Edgehill in 1642. O Lord, thou knowest how busy we must be today. If we forget thee, do not thou forget us." Admiral Holland opened up the battle at 5:52 a.m., firing a salvo at the lead ship in the German formation, which must have been misidentified as Bismarck, but it was actually the Prince Eugen. Bismarck was soon correctly identified, and the Prince of Wales shifted her focus, while Hood kept tracking the lead ship Prince Eugen, and she likely shifted her fire from Prince Eugen to Bismarck during the battle. To what effect or to what time this occurred, both are uncertain. After her first salvo, the Prince of Wales suffered from mechanical problems. It hampered her ability to fight. The Germans soon opened fire at about the same time as the Prince of Wales, and at 5:55 a.m., Hood and Prince of Wales executed a turn of 20 degrees to port to bring their after guns into play, as only their forward guns would bear at the angle of the early engagement. It should be noted that both sides were exchanging salvos during this time. The third salvo from Bismarck hit Hood's boat deck near the main mast, and a fierce fire broke out because of it. At around 6 a.m., the British ships were making another 20-degree turn when Bismarck's fifth salvo hit Hood. One or two shells fell in the area of the boat deck and possibly near or below the waterline. Hood would erupt with flames and explode, break in two, and go down within 3 minutes. There is some evidence to say that Hood fired her aft 15-inch guns just before the explosion or simultaneously with the hit. Following the destruction of Hood, both Prince Eugen and Bismarck concentrated their fire on Prince of Wales. In the process, they hit the Prince of Wales several times, including in the bridge, killing a majority of those in it. However, during the battle, the Prince of Wales scored 2 hits on Bismarck, flooding a boiler room, reducing speed, causing oil leaks, and putting the ship 2 degrees down by the head. A couple of minutes after 6 a.m., the Prince of Wales disengaged and turned away from the German ships, with the Germans electing to go on the same course rather than finishing off the Prince of Wales. Let's take a look at an account of one of her surviving crew, Ted Briggs, an ordinary signalman who was on the bridge at the time of the explosion, where he writes, "After the initial jarring, she listed slowly, almost hesitatingly, to starboard. She stopped after about 10 degrees when I heard the helmsman's voice shouting up the voice pipe to the officer of the watch. 'Steering's gone, sir.' The reply of 'very good' showed no signs of animation or agitation. Immediately Kerr ordered, 'Change over to emergency steering.' Although the Hood had angled to starboard, there was still no concern on the compass platform. Holland was back in his chair. He looked aft towards the Prince of Wales and then trained his binoculars on the Bismarck. Slowly, the Hood righted herself. Thank heaven for that, I murmured to myself, only to be terrorized by her sudden horrifying cant to port. On and on she rolled until she reached an angle of 45 degrees. After this, Briggs made his way out of the compass platform along with everyone else who could, except for Holland and Kerr. Briggs continued to move along the Admiral's bridge, and Hood was almost on her beam ends. He was halfway down the ladder when he was washed into the sea with a long ordeal ahead of him. He continues, "This was it, I realized, but I wasn't going to give in easily. I knew the deckhead of the compass platform was above me and that I must try to swim away from it. I managed to avoid being knocked out by the steel stanchions, but I was not making progress. The suction was dragging me down. The pressure on my ears was increasing each second, and panic returned in its worst intensity. I was going to die. I struggled madly to try to heave myself up to the surface. I got nowhere. Although it seemed an eternity, I was underwater for barely a minute. My lungs were bursting. I knew that I just had to breathe and opened my lips and gulped in a mouthful of water. My tongue was forced to the back of my throat. I was not going to reach the surface. I was going to die. As I weakened, my resolve left me. What was the use of struggling? Panic subsided. I had heard it was nice to drown. I stopped trying to swim upward. The water was a peaceful cradle. I was being rocked off to sleep. There was nothing I could do about it. Good night, Mum. Now I lay me down. I was ready to meet God. My blissful acceptance of death ended in a sudden surge beneath me, which shot me up to the surface like a decanted cork in a champagne bottle. I wasn't going to die. I treaded water as I panted in great gulps of air. I was alive. Briggs, Ted Tilburn, and William Dundas, the three surviving members of Hood's crew, found themselves on what would have been the port side of Hood, and below them, the pride of the Royal Navy and over 1,400 men were sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And before I forget, HMS Electra was the ship that picked up the survivors. Next up, we have HMS Barham. In late 1941, the battle raged in North Africa between Allied and Axis forces. The Mediterranean fleet, although battered and bruised from the evacuation of Crete, convoy operations to Malta, and acting in support of Allied land forces on the African continent, the fleet was out supporting land forces late in the month of November as Italian convoys were heading to North Africa with supplies for Rommel's Africa Corps and other Axis soldiers. Force K from Malta, consisting of the cruisers Aurora, Penelope, and the destroyers Lance and Lively, and Force B from Alexandria, consisting of the cruisers Ajax, Neptune, the destroyers Kimberley and Kingston, sortied to meet the Italian forces on the 23rd of November. Force K intercepted and sank the Italian convoy on the 24th of November. However, Vincent P. O'Hara, in his book The Struggle for the Middle Sea, The Great Navies at War in the Mediterranean Theater, 1940 to 1945, has this to say. The risk involved in every sortie was demonstrated 2 days later. Admiral Cunningham, pressed by Churchill, who wired as naval commander on November 23rd, stopping these ships may save thousands of lives apart from aiding a victory of cardinal importance, had sailed with the Mediterranean fleet to support further sorties of Force K and Force B. The Mediterranean fleet was out in force, including the battleships Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Barham, while a threat to the battleships lurked beneath the waves in the form of a German U-boat, U-331, commanded by Hans Dietrich von Tessenhausen. German U-boats in the Mediterranean were proving to be an issue, just like in the Atlantic, with their introduction in September and reinforcements in November of 1941, sinking major warships like the carrier HMS Ark Royal while she helped to deliver hurricanes to Malta earlier in November. Von Tessenhausen was a seasoned sailor, having been on numerous U-boat patrols in the Atlantic. However, U-331 was his first command, and he had gone on several previous patrols with U-331 with little success. This most successful patrol for von Tessenhausen began from the Greek island of Salamis, where the U-boat had some work done and made its way south toward the North African coast, where U-331 was informed of the Mediterranean fleet's sortie from Alexandria and how they intended to support the disruption of Italian convoys. For several days, the boat maneuvered as destroyers moved overhead until early in the afternoon on the 25th of November, when an Italian plane flew overhead. As the U-boat surfaced at 2 p.m., faint smoke could be seen over the horizon, and at 2:41, destroyers and 3 battleships could be made out. As the distance decreased between U-331 and the oncoming British ships, von Tessenhausen ordered his boat to dive and began to maneuver his way through the screen of destroyers when, at 4:20, the now or never moment came, and von Tessenhausen had to pick a battleship to fire at. The first he could not reach a shooting position for, so he turned his attention to the second and fired a spread of torpedoes, of which 3 struck HMS Barham. U-331 was fired at and forced to crash dive to a depth well beyond what she was intended to go and survived the damage. Von Tessenhausen would go on to do more patrols until U-331 was sunk in November of 1942, surviving the sinking of his U-boat. Barham on the 25th of November 1941, on the other hand, would not. Queen Elizabeth, Barham, and Valiant were sailing in a line-ahead formation at a speed of 17 knots and zigzagging. The battleships had an escort of destroyers that were supposed to protect against submarine attack. The screen did not detect U-331 when 3 torpedoes struck Barham very close together, so close that some thought it was one large hit. There was no time for evasive maneuvers, with Valiant's officer of the watch ordering hard to port when realizing the battleship had been hit. With a ship as old as Barham and the limited amount of modernization, it's no surprise that Barham began listing to port very quickly. So much so that she was still moving forward as she continued to turn over. As the ship continued to list over and her crew tried to go over the side, Barham exploded violently, throwing men and metal into the air and having them crash down into the sea. Likely, we'll never know the exact details of the explosion. Turning to British battleships 1906 to 1946, Dr. Norman Friedman discusses the official report from the Admiralty. The torpedoes hit between the funnel and the after turrets, causing the ship to list rapidly. 4 minutes after the hits, with the ship on her beam ends, there was a heavy explosion, probably between X and Y magazines. The Board of Inquiry concluded that the torpedoes had blown in the side of the ship, causing such rapid flooding that she quickly listed to 40 degrees, paused slightly, and then rolled over. The board could not be certain of the cause of the explosion, but suggested that it was due to a fire that started in the port side 4-inch magazine, which spread to the adjacent 15-inch magazine. By the time the ship exploded, she had already capsized. The officer of the watch on the nearby Valiant stated that all observers agreed that there had been 3 explosions, 1 and then 2 in quick succession, all amidships between funnel and main mast. The general opinion at the time was that the big explosion was the 6-inch magazine, rather than A or B, as the center of the explosion was abaft the bridge. The officer thought it was forward of X and Y magazines. ADO/PCO of Barham felt 3 torpedo explosions and a 4th abreast the main mast. To take from Lieutenant Wolfe, a survivor, at the time of the first explosion, I was just outside my office, which was on the port side of the ADO flat. This is the first deck above the boat deck on the bridge structure. Since I was leaving the office, I was facing aft and saw the flash of the explosion, which appeared to be immediately above the funnel. After a slight pause, 2 further explosions occurred, both slightly further aft. I crossed immediately to the starboard side, where a crowd was already gathering on the upper deck, and gave my pocket knife to a PO who was trying to unlash 2 Carly floats, which were secured at the bottom of the ladder up to the pom-pom deck. I went rapidly back to my office for my Burberry, a large overcoat, and then returned to the starboard side with some difficulty as there was already an appreciable list. I descended to the upper deck where the ship's company was already going over the side. I shouted to all near me to follow their example, rather unnecessarily, as there was little panic, and the men were not wasting any time. The list was steadily increasing, and as everyone about me was over the guardrail, I went over also at the point level with the forward end of the bridge and slid down to the bilge keel. By now, she was going over fast, and I reached the bottom of the ship, now an almost vertical wall. Here I hesitated, owing to the difficulty of keeping my balance because the final jump appeared hazardous, with the bottom coming to meet me. It was then a big explosion took place aft, and the ship plunged over so rapidly that I was flung backwards into the water with many others. After being sucked down, we eventually surfaced, and I swam over to a Carly float which appeared close at hand. All traces of the ship had vanished. I discarded my Burberry, blew up my lifebelt, and held on to the side of a float with many more until picked up by HMS Hotspur 1 hour later. As we saw, the final loss of the ship all captured on film, making it a uniquely tragic tale. Out of her large crew, 862 men were killed. Of these, there were 56 officers and 806 ratings, while around 400 were saved. Of course, this isn't an exhaustive list. There were more disastrous sinkings in the war. For example, Ark Royal or Eagle come to mind. This was just a bit of a compilation video I pieced together because it seemed like an interesting subject to explore. Let me know what you think about these disasters in the comments. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have an amazing week.